Okay, in this video we'll be looking at the instrument cluster, which in my opinion is the most important diagnostic tool running of your car that there is, and it's the one that's right in front of you. Now this is an awkward video to make really, because all cars are different, and this is quite an old car. However, it does have a reasonable number of features which are shared with modern cars, and I'll try my best to explain features that you may not find on this car. Now, many people, I think, look at this all the time and don't really understand exactly everything you see in front of you. So I'm going to teach you how to suck eggs in this video and not gloss over anything. Because there may be some things that I think are obvious that you don't know, and perhaps there's some things that I don't know that you think are obvious. So we'll start over on the left, and this dial here is called a tachometer. And now, if you notice, it's marked in variations of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, so it goes up in tens. You may on your car go up in just single digits. It might go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. Now, the reason for that is that this instrument here is not actually measuring 10 or 20, it's actually measuring thousands. So when the needle is pointing at 10, the car is not doing 10, it's doing 1,000. And 1,000 what is it doing? Well, it's doing 1,000 revolutions per minute. Now that is actually stated here in the scientific way of doing it. Well, not the correct way of doing it actually, but it's saying 1 over a minute. So 1 in this case is revolutions, and it's per minute. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the crankshaft of your engine, which is the largest part of your engine really, and it's the part that almost directly turns the flywheel and then the clutch and then the wheels via the gearbox. That part of your engine is what the speed of what this is measuring. The camshafts of the engine turn at half crankshaft speed. So this dial is measuring the speed of your crankshaft, and it's measuring how many times it revolves or turns over once in 1 minute. So if you are doing so this is people walking into my car there, so if we're doing 1 here, it's turning over 1,000 times in every minute. Now, why do we need to know this? Well, you don't actually really need to know this. Most people could quite happily drive without it. I certainly could and have. If you have an automatic gearbox, you certainly don't need this whatsoever, but it's a nice thing to look at. And it isn't really hugely relevant what the number is. It's more kind of where the numbers are. And every engine you see has what they call a different torque curve, and your engine may present most power at a certain point, it may present most torque at a certain point. You'll get to know that, and from the rev counter, which is what most people call this, you can determine this information. Now, does it really affect your everyday driving? No, it doesn't actually. If you're really going for it, it's a good indicator of when you need to change up. You need to change up before this needle goes into the red area. Just around here somewhere, the engine's electronic control unit will limit the speed of the engine, and you'll hit what's called the rev limiter. Now, diesel engine will have a lower red line, perhaps around 5,000 RPM. If you have some performance engines, such as a VTEC engine, your red line will be sort of, well, it won't be around here, it will be here, but it will go up to sort of 9,000 RPM in the case of something like a Honda S2000. Now, as I say, is it really important to know? Absolutely not. It is not important to know what RPM you're doing. You should drive your car through the feel, and you should be really trying to change into a high gear as possible without labouring the engine to save fuel. However, The rev counter does have one really great use, and that is to tell you where the engine is idling, and if it's idling smoothly. Your engine should idle about 800 RPM. It may vary, it may go higher and it may go a little bit lower depending on the engine. But if you have some faults with your engine, you can actually really easily determine that something's amiss because your revs will sit at a different point. And you might be able to hear that, in fact you should be able to hear that, but it's really nice to be able to see it actually in writing, as it were. So the rev counter, I think, is pretty unimportant, but it's a really nice thing to have. I really not like a car without it. In fact, I've had cars without it and I've added rev counters, but it isn't absolutely essential to drive. You can certainly drive without one, but it's sort of it's one of these features that has become very cheap and easy to add to cars. So in this car, well, there we are. It's given it as much importance as the speedometer. So down here we've got a clock, down here we have a multifunction display, and then we have the odometer. Now the odometer simply displays the number of miles since the car was made. Well, you hope it does anyway, unless it's been clocked. So, you know, this car's covered 151,000 miles, and then there's a trip counter, which is reset with this button on the Volkswagen. That displays how many miles it's been since you've pressed the button and reset the trip counter. Now up here we have the coolant temperature gauge. Now the coolant temperature gauge, in my opinion, is much more important than the tachometer. In fact, I'd say it's almost more important than the fuel gauge. But inexplicably, quite a lot of modern cars don't have a temperature gauge, and I think that's really ridiculous. But anyway, the temperature gauge is measuring one of two metrics on the engine, and this particular temperature gauge is measuring the coolant temperature. You can tell that because it has this symbol. That means coolant temperature and not oil temperature. Oil temperature is arguably more important, but it's also something that you can do slightly less about. Now, most modern cars will like to sit at around 90 degrees, and this is something that you should really keep an eye out for. When you first start the engine, the temperature gauge will be down here to the left, and this obviously indicates that the engine is cold. When the engine's cold, you should not labour it. That means that you shouldn't keep the revs too low and use lots of throttle. You shouldn't use lots of throttle. You shouldn't give it lots of revs. You should just drive it very gently. Now, when the temperature gauge comes up, it should come off the stop, as I call it, and get to 90 degrees quite quickly. Within about 5 minutes to 10 minutes of driving, depending on the outside temperature and whether your car's a diesel or a petrol. Diesels will take much longer to warm up than petrols. And it's very important that your temperature gauge, once it's warmed up, stays at 90 degrees or thereabouts. It shouldn't drop down, especially in a Volkswagen. They have a temperature gauge that actually doesn't quite show the correct temperature. It lies a bit to you, and it will say 90 unless it's really cold or really hot. And your temperature gauge, unless you've just started the engine, should sit at 90. And it should sit at 90 even if you're really going for it. I mean, even if you were to be going flat out, your temperature gauge should still sit at 90. Your car has a thermostat that keeps the engine hot. It doesn't actually keep the engine from staying cold. It keeps the engine hot. And if your thermostat has failed, the temperature gauge will drop down, and that's very bad for fuel economy. So if you're seeing that, then your car is in need of repair. Your temperature gauge should sit in the middle or very close to it. On Vauxhalls and some cars, they don't have a stabilised temperature gauge, and it may sort of fluctuate a little bit around the middle, but it should stay in one point. Now, you may notice that the red line is actually 130. If you're towing with a vehicle, you're not going to be getting much airflow over the radiator because you're not going very fast. However, you're putting a lot of load on the engine. Now, the cars are capable of running at high temperatures, and this one's no exception. And you can actually push the temperature system, the coolant system, and you can run it up to 130 degrees, or up to that point, without causing significant harm. However, that should only happen if you're towing. If the temperature gauge, for whatever reason, starts to go above 90, especially if you're stuck in traffic, or if you're not stuck in traffic, you're just driving normally, then you have a problem with the cooling system, and you really should turn the engine off and investigate further, especially if it very quickly goes up in temperature. You can cause enormous damage to your engine enormously quickly. The same way is if you're driving along and the temperature gauge suddenly goes cold, that can also be an indication of a serious and dangerous fault to your cooling system. Coming on to the next one, we have the fuel gauge. Now, it's got a symbol of a petrol pump here. Now, if that petrol pump has an arrow to the left or to the right, which this doesn't, but if it did, that would be the side which your fuel filler cap is on. So if you've got a little arrow and it's pointing to the right, then your cap is on the right. That's if you're an idiot and you can't remember which side it's on, but it's quite useful if you've never driven that car before. Now, fuel gauges are notoriously inaccurate, and they're all inaccurate. When the gauge is at full, 1 as it says there, 1 hole, it isn't actually full. It just means that the sender has reached as far as it will go. You've actually got quite a bit after full until the tank is actually full. So what you may notice, if you really brim your tank at the petrol station, it takes ages for the needles to start moving, and then when it does start moving, it moves rather quickly. And the same is true when it gets to empty. The tank isn't actually empty. You've still got quite a few miles left after that. However, I would never let the car run out of fuel if you can absolutely avoid it, because it can cause damage to your fuel pump. Again, this indicator is rather important, but it isn't that important. If you just had a low fuel light, really it would suffice. Which probably most people disagree with, but I'd rather not have a fuel gauge and have a temperature gauge than the other way around. Now, to the left and right of that, we've got indicator telltale lamps, which these are quite useful because they enable you to do diagnostics on your bulbs, believe it or not. Now, if you indicate and these flash fast, then that means you have an indicator bulb out on that side. Obviously, if they don't flash at all, then you've got a problem with your flasher system. In the centre here, we've got another telltale light. That tells you if your full beam's on. Some people obviously never look at them. And then we've got the speedometer. Now, in this country and in the United States, we bizarrely use the imperial system of measurements. So this one's dual marked. It's a legal requirement for a UK car to have kilometres an hour as well as miles per hour. And this dial is reasonably interesting as well in terms of diagnosis, because it tells you generally the speed of the final drive of the gearbox, but in some circumstances it may not do that. It may be giving you a speed reading from the ABS sensors, etc, etc. So that's the boring off information. Now I'm going to turn the ignition on but not start the engine. This is actually an extremely important step. Now, this particular cluster is an intelligent one. It has a computer in it, and it's going to run a self-check of the car before I start the engine, and it should bleep if it has any warnings. However, your car may not have such sort of self-checking system, and we can do some self-checks ourselves before starting the engine, which are rather important. So we'll just turn that on. Now, what we should see is all these warning symbols illuminate and then extinguish. Now, what you should be looking out for is, the most important one is the oil light and the oil pressure light. Now, on cars without a self-diagnosis function, this light should come on and remain illuminated until the engine is started. However, on this car, it doesn't do that. It does extinguish because it knows the engine's not running. But we should check that it comes on. So we're just going to check for that now. There we are. This is the oil pressure light, and that has come on. Okay, so that's good. That means that we've got a working oil pressure detection system. Now, the oil pressure light is the light I want to talk about most, and it's the one that's misunderstood the most as well. Now, if you notice that this oil pressure light is red, and that means one thing and one thing only. If that light comes on and it is red, it means that you have low oil pressure. Now, if that light comes on, you must immediately turn the engine off. Now, if you're in a real life or death situation, literally life or death situation, and you must keep the engine on, then keep it on. However, you are likely to need a new engine if you run your engine for more than, well, really a second with that light on. It is absolutely imperative that you never run an engine with the oil pressure light illuminated at anything above idle. If that light comes on, it doesn't mean that you've got low oil. It may be because you have low oil, but it means that you have low oil pressure, and that is causing damage to your engine immediately. Now, if it comes on just for a second and flashes off, perhaps when you're going around the corner, you should turn your engine off, pull over, and immediately check your oil level. You'll probably find it's low. However, if it comes on, you turn the engine off and you have oil in the engine, do not, under any circumstances, attempt to restart your engine. You should call a mechanic or the AA or the RAC or something and explicitly say to them, do not attempt to start this engine. It must, and I repeat, must not be started, because it will cause severe damage. I've heard of many people who've had the oil pressure light come on, checked the oil level and thought, well, there's oil in there, that seems alright, I'm just going to keep driving, and have ended up with a seized engine and a many £1,000 bill. Now, if you do heed my advice and you don't start the engine and it gets taken to a garage, they can then check the electrical system that feeds this lamp, and they can also probably take the sump off and check the oil pump and find that it's clogged up or similar, and effect a really quite cheap repair rather than an extremely expensive one. So I really would pay vast attention to that lamp. You should also check that it does illuminate, as I say, because if it doesn't illuminate, then you've got an electrical fault, and that means that that system isn't going to tell you if you do happen to lose oil pressure. Now, we'll have a look at some of the other lights that are illuminated at the moment, but they're not all illuminated. Now, the second most important light, perhaps, is this one over here, which is a picture of a battery. Now, you may think, rather logically, that this is some sort of battery warning light. Well, very confusingly, it is not a battery warning light, quite the opposite. This is actually the battery charging light. Now, this light symbolises that the battery is not being charged. Now, the reason the battery is not being charged is the engine is not running. Now, this light should extinguish when you start your engine. So you should check that this light comes on, and when you start the engine, it should go off. It might not go off immediately. You might have to give a little blip of the revs before it does go off. But if it stays on, you can keep driving the car, but I would advise you pull into the nearest garage and get them to have a look at it, because you've probably broken your alternator belt. Now, on some cars, the alternator belt powers other things like the water pump or the power steering pump. Now, if that's broken, you could overheat the engine. So, a good idea to keep an eye on the temperature gauge and maybe have a look under the bonnet. If the belt's broken, you might be able to limp it very gently to a garage, but perhaps it would be a good idea to call the AA. However, if you lift the bonnet and nothing looks broken, you've probably just got a failed alternator, which means you can actually drive the car to your house if it's relatively near, or you can drive it to a garage that perhaps isn't the first one you come across, and that would prevent you having to go to a quick fit or the like. Now, if this light does come on under any circumstances, however, and you do wish to drive the car, that's fine, but you must drive the car with as few electrical loads as possible. That means turn the radio off, turn the air conditioning off, turn the wipers off, turn the lights off, only put on what you absolutely have to. Now, above that we have this warning light. Now, this is a red warning light. Red warning lights are serious Yellow ones are sort of, you should have a look. Now, you may get some yellow warning lights that look similar to red ones. Now, that doesn't mean they're the same thing, and this is an important one here. This warning light is what most people think of as the handbrake warning light. Well, it sort of is, and it sort of isn't. Now, if I put the handbrake down on this car, you'll see that the light extinguishes, and if I reapply it, it comes back on. Now, that is a serious warning light, and it's serious because you shouldn't drive along with your handbrake on. It can cause enormous damage to your car. However, if that light comes on and your handbrake is not applied, it's actually telling you something else. Now, if that light comes on at the same time as the ABS warning light, then you probably have something wrong with your ABS system. If this warning light comes on and it's on its own and the handbrake's down, then you've probably run out of brake fluid, or the brake fluid has just dropped below the minimum level. So if this light does come on when you're driving along, then you should pull over immediately and check the brake fluid level. Now, if the brake fluid level is just a tiny bit below the minimum, it might be prudent just to add a tiny amount of brake fluid and keep an eye on it. However, if there's no brake fluid in there whatsoever, then you've almost certainly broken a brake line, and you'll probably find there's a soggy patch, in which case you probably shouldn't drive the car any further, and you should arrange recovery, as you're then running on basically half your brakes, and that's a really very dangerous situation to be in. Now, let's have a look at some orange warning lights. This orange warning light is rather similar to this red warning light, and the reason for that is that is the brake pad warning system. So if your brake pads are low, this light will come on, and this is just an advisory thing. It's just saying, at some point you should probably take me to a garage and get the brake pads looked at because they're running a little bit low. The same as the low fuel light and the low windscreen washer light. Those are advisory lights. However, if this light comes on, then that means that you have low coolant or the engine's overheating. Either way, you shouldn't ignore that situation, and you should quickly pull over and determine the source of the problem. And we'll have another video under the bonnet where we can we'll go over the checks that you should do if any of these lights come on. The checks you should do weekly to ensure that you don't have a breakdown. Again, if you see this light come on but it's orange, that means that you have low oil. Now, people get rather alarmed by that light. Actually, it's not a terribly serious light. It's just advising you that you should check your oil level. If it comes on suddenly, well, you probably haven't checked your dipstick in a while, and you should do so. But it's not a sort of you really have to stop the car immediately. However, if it's a red light, then, as I say, you really have to turn the engine off as soon as you can. Now, as it happens, if you turn the key off and all the way, you may put the steering lock on. So if it does happen when you're driving, you should literally just turn the key enough to turn the ignition off, but not enough to lock the steering lock. I would really advise that if at all possible. Now, this yellowy orange light is one that's unique to Volkswagens, and that stands for electronic power control. Now, this light may come on, and if it does, it's symbolising that there's a fault with the engine management system. So it's really something that's not really relevant to the average user, and it's really saying, take me to a garage. If that comes on whilst the engine is running. However, if it's on when the engine is not running, then it's nothing to be concerned about. And the last warning light, which this cluster is displaying, is this cruise control light. Now, on more modern cars, the cruise control light only is illuminated when the cruise control is on, but this is quite an old car. So basically all that light tells you is if the switch is on or off, which is a bit pointless really, because you can quite obviously see that it's on or off from the position of the switch. I'll probably make a video on the correct use of cruise control a little bit later. Now, there is another warning light here, which is, you you can just see it there, which is the immobiliser light. If that light flashes at you, there's a fault with the immobiliser, which basically means that the chip, which is contained in the head of the key here and communicates with the barrel, the pickup barrel on the car, there's a communication fault between those two, and that basically means that the car will start but not run. If that happens, I would try another key if you have one. If not, I would sort of flip the key 180 degrees over and try it again. Now on this car we have a rather basic multifunction display, but I'll show you that anyway. In the bottom half we have the outside temperature, which is 20.5 degrees Celsius. Top half we have what's called the average MPG function. Now on Volkswagens from the 1980s to the present day, on the basic MFA system there are two trip computers. There's one and then there's two. Now you cycle between them by pressing this button. One resets itself after 2 hours. If you don't drive the car for 2 hours, it simply just zeroes out. Two, on the other hand, only resets itself when you reset it with this button. Now to reset it you have to hold the button down. So one's quite useful because that's basically from the start of that current journey. If you leave the car for 2 hours, it resets. So this is your average MPG, and it's just showing line because we haven't driven anywhere. And then it's showing you miles, so obviously 0 miles because we haven't driven anywhere. Average speed, well, it's pretty obvious. Time since start, well, it's 27 minutes because I've been sitting here flicking the ignition on and off. Now, rather peculiarly, it's saying I'm getting 25.2 mpg. Well, that's obviously complete rubbish because I've got the engine off. So, but this is instantaneous mpg, and that's what you're doing at the moment. It's really quite useless because it fluctuates way too much to be useful in my opinion. So we won't worry about that at all. And then it goes back round to the start. However, on your car, you may have more functions, or you may have fewer. On some Volkswagens, you're able to view oil temperature, and that is actually much more important than coolant temperature, because the coolant temperature will get up to temperature before the oil temperature, and if you have a high performance car, you shouldn't really use all the car's performance until the oil temperature has reached a normal level, even though the coolant temperature may be at 90 degrees. So that is an overview of the instrument cluster on this 2000 Passat. Your experience may differ, and if you've got any questions about different symbols on your instrument cluster, then you should contact me and I'll be happy to explain it to you. But I do think it's very important that you are fully acquainted with all the symbols and readings that your instrument cluster is able to give you, because it gives you great insight into the health of your car, and in a lot of cases an early warning before things really get serious. And when you own a car, it's all about preventing problems. We shouldn't be repairing conditions when they've got too late and become very expensive. We should be preventing issues from occurring, so you can drive your car in the full knowledge that it's not going to break down, or it's very unlikely to break down, and you can be able to think about driving safely rather than worrying about breakdowns. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.